There's one thing my grandmother always used to tell me when I was a child. Every time I went to sleep at her house, she would call me to sit beside her, lower her voice as if she were telling me a very serious secret, and say, "Never stop at the crossroads after midnight, and if someone offers you something in that place, you refuse, no matter what it is, no matter what they promise you." When I asked why, she never explained it properly. She only said there were things she would not put into words because words have weight, and that weight she did not want inside her house. I grew up thinking it was old people's superstition, folklore, one of those stories older people invent to scare children and make them stay quiet. But there is one night I cannot forget. One night that completely changed the way I see this world and everything it hides. Let me tell you what happened, from the beginning, because for you to understand what I saw, you need to understand what point in life I was in. It was winter, one of those freezing nights that make your skin crawl and seem to last longer than they should, where darkness arrives earlier and leaves later, and silence has a different texture, heavier, more alive. I was driving back home after a week that had destroyed me from the inside, working too much, sleeping too little, eating badly, living on autopilot in that way we live when we are trying not to think about something. And the thing I was trying not to think about was my father. He had been hospitalized for 3 weeks, something serious. The doctors used big technical words, and behind each one of those words there was a smaller message they did not say directly, but I understood very well. I had spent the last few days going back and forth from the hospital, pretending to be fine for him in visits, and falling apart in the car when I left. That night, I had gone to a place on the other side of the city to solve a work problem that could not wait, even with everything that was happening, because life does not stop. That is one of the quietest cruelties that exists. Your world may be falling apart, but the bills keep arriving, the boss keeps sending messages, and you still have to function as if you were whole. On the way back, the GPS started malfunctioning. First it became slow, then it froze, then it started sending me through routes that seemed more and more alternative, farther and farther from the main road. I assumed there had been some accident or roadblock and let it guide me. My mistake. 40 minutes later, I was in a place I had never seen in my life. Brush on both sides, old asphalt road full of patches with the markings almost erased. Completely covered sky, no phone signal, no gas stations, no houses, absolutely nothing indicating there was human life nearby. And then I arrived at a crossroads. 4 roads branching from the same point, like a star drawn on the asphalt. No signs, no light besides my car's headlights. The beam of light illuminated a patch of dirt in the center, surrounded by that tall, dark brush that starts to look like something else when you stare at it for too long. I turned off the car to think, to try to remember some reference point, some way out. And it was in the silence of that moment, with the engine off and the wind outside, that I realized I was not alone. There was a man sitting on a rock at the side of the road. I cannot explain where he came from. I swear that when I turned off the car, I looked everywhere and there was nobody there. But when I looked again, he was there, as if he had always been there, and I was the one who had failed to see him. Dark hat, simple dark clothes too, nothing extraordinary in appearance. A middle-aged man, apparently, sitting in a completely relaxed way on that rock in the middle of nowhere, at midnight, as if he were waiting for the bus. Except there was no bus. There was nothing for miles. He looked at my car, then looked at me through the window and smiled. A polite smile, almost kind, but one that did not reach the eyes. I stayed inside the car for about 30 seconds, trying to decide what to do. The rational part of me said it was just a person, that I was in an unknown place, that he probably lived nearby and could help me find the way out. The other part of me, the one you learn to ignore but that is rarely wrong, had its hand on the accelerator. I rolled down the window, just a little. "Lost?" he asked. The voice was normal, pleasant even, without any strong accent, without anything strange in the sound itself. But there was something in the way he said that word, lost, that made me feel he was not referring only to the road. I said yes. I asked if he knew which road led back to the city. He pointed to the road on my right without even blinking, without hesitating, like someone pointing to something he had known forever. I thanked him, put my hand on the handle to close the window, and he spoke. "Before you go, let me ask you a question." And I did the stupidest thing I could have done. I stayed. I cannot explain to you why. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe because at that time I was so overwhelmed that even the idea of a random conversation with a stranger seemed better than going back to the silence inside my head. But I stayed, and I asked, "What?" "Are you satisfied with your life?" That question pierced me in a way I did not expect, not because it was a difficult question to answer, but because it went straight to the most painful place I had at that moment, with that surgical precision of someone who knows exactly where to press. And I, idiot that I am, was honest. I said no. I said I was in one of the worst moments of my life, that my father was hospitalized and I did not know what was going to happen, that I worked a lot and felt like I was not moving forward, that life seemed to be passing, and I increasingly had the feeling that I was running in a place that never moved. I said more than I should have, much more. And while I spoke, he remained completely still, looking at me, with that expression of total attention that few people can fake, and that no real person can sustain for too long without blinking, without giving some sign that the mind has gone elsewhere. He went nowhere. He stayed there, absorbing every word, as if mentally taking notes. When he finished, there was a silence of maybe 10 seconds, which felt like much more. Then he spoke. "And what if I told you I can help you?" I let out a nervous laugh. I asked how. He explained calmly, like someone who had already had that conversation many times. He said there was an agreement that could be made there, at that crossroads, at that hour, that I asked what I wanted, and in return, at some future moment, I would give him something of equivalent value. Something of equivalent value. He did not specify what it was, and I should have asked. I should have turned the car around right there, but I did neither. I asked what specifically he could do. He answered without hurry. He said he could guarantee my father would recover, that my financial situation would stabilize, that the paths that were blocked would become unblocked. He said it very directly, very concretely, without metaphor, without going around the subject. And that was what truly scared me. Not the proposal, its specificity. Because I had not mentioned anything about finances. I had spoken about my father, about work in a vague way, but I had not said I was having money problems. And he knew. Or at least he spoke as if he knew. I looked at him for a long moment and asked something I had not planned to ask. "What are you?" He did not blink. He did not move. He kept staring at me for a length of time that was hard to measure, and then that smile returned, but slightly different this time. wider, sharper. "I am someone who keeps promises," he said. And it was exactly at that moment that the world changed texture. It's difficult to describe with words because what happened was not visual, not sound. It was physical. The air around the car became heavier. The temperature dropped in a way that was not natural, not the normal cold of a winter night. It was something else, as if the heat had been sucked out from the inside outward. The wind that had been blowing since I arrived stopped completely. Zero. Absolute silence. And I felt a weight in my chest, a real physical tightness that started in the center of my chest and spread through my shoulders, through my neck, as if the space around me had become solid in an invisible way, as if gravity had slightly increased around the car. And it was at that moment that I heard my grandmother's voice. Not from outside, from inside. So clear, so sharp, so present, that for half a second I looked at the back seat, certain she was there. "Never accept anything in that place, no matter what it is, no matter what they promise you." I refused. It was not an act of courage. It was not a heroic decision. There was no speech. I simply looked at the man and said, "No thank you," with a slightly shaky voice, rolled the window up, started the car, and drove away. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not slightly, the kind where you need to grip hard to keep control of the direction. As I took the road he had indicated, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was standing now. He had stepped off the rock and was standing in the center of the crossroads, watching me as I drove away. There was no anger on his face, no threat, only that static, calm, patient look of someone who is not in a hurry because he knows time is plentiful. I did not look at the mirror again. I drove for 20-something minutes in total silence, no music, nothing. When I finally reached the main highway and saw gas stations and traffic signs, I pulled over to the shoulder and stayed there for about 8-10 minutes, just breathing, trying to convince my nervous system that everything was okay. But the story does not end there, because what came after was in a certain way more disturbing than the encounter itself. The next night, I had the first dream. I was back at the crossroads. Same road, same cold, same darkness. But this time, I was outside the car, standing, and the man was in front of me. And in the dream, I had said yes. There was no violent scene, nothing dramatic. It was more like a feeling that grew as the dream moved forward. The feeling that something was being taken from me. Not money, not a physical object. It was something without shape, without a name, but I could recognize as mine with absolute certainty. As if you could feel a part of yourself being separated without pain, and the absence itself was what hurt. I woke up at 3:18 in the morning, sitting in bed, covered in cold sweat, with that tightness in my chest again. I stayed awake until sunrise. In the days after, I tried not to think about it. But then came the second thing. I ran into my neighbor on a Sunday morning. We talked sometimes, hallway conversation, nothing major. That day, without any context, without me mentioning anything about what had happened to me, he started talking about his father. He said his father had died a few years earlier, and that near the end of his life, the old man had become obsessed with telling a story to anyone willing to listen, about a road decades earlier, about an encounter he had had, about an agreement he had made when he was in a desperate moment. His life improved after that, the neighbor said, with a strange flat voice. Good job, good health for many years, family. Everything he had asked for in one way or another came, but he was never the same again. You looked into his eyes and something was missing. The light was gone. Until the day he died, he was a different man from what he had been before. And then he looked at me and said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he always said he was waiting for the bill to come due. I did not comment anything. I did not tell him anything about my night. I went home, closed the door, and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The third thing was what really broke me. A few days later, I went to visit my father at the hospital. He was a little better that day, more lucid, more present than in the previous weeks. We talked about normal things, about family, about a series he had watched on the TV in the room. It was a good visit. Near the end, when I was getting ready to leave, he held my wrist. Not tightly, just the touch of someone who wants to make sure you stay a little longer. Son, there's something I needed to tell you a long time ago. I just never found the right moment. I sat back down. He looked toward the window for a moment, as if choosing the words, or as if they'd checked that nobody else would hear. And then, he told me that before I was born, he had gone through a very difficult period. Serious problems, the kind that put an entire life at risk. And that one night, driving on a road he did not know, he had arrived at a crossroads and had met a man. I felt my blood run cold. I said nothing. I just kept listening. My father said the man had made him a proposal similar to what I already knew. That he, young, desperate, unable to see a way out, had accepted. He had asked for stability, health, for things to work out. And things had worked out. Everything I asked for came, he said. Not magically, not overnight, but it came. The doors that had been closed started opening, and for a long time I told myself it was coincidence, that I had changed my attitude, that I had worked harder, that luck had changed. He stopped, looked at his hands. But there is one thing that never went away. A feeling. You know when you feel like you forgot to do something important, but you cannot remember what? That is how I have felt since that night. Every time I sleep, there's a moment before I drift off when I feel like someone is waiting. Not angrily, just waiting. We sat in silence for a while. Then he said quietly, "I'm afraid that waiting is coming to an end." I wanted to say no. I wanted to say he was going to be fine, that it was imagination, that decades of guilt and worry had built that feeling inside his head. I wanted to say many things, but I could not say anything. Because I had been at that crossroads days before, and I knew, in a way impossible to prove but impossible to deny, that what he had felt for decades was real. The third thing was what really broke me. A few days later, I went to visit my father at the hospital. He was a little better that day, more lucid, more present than in the previous weeks. We talked about normal things, about family, about a series he had watched on the TV in the room. It was a good visit. Near the end, when I was getting ready to leave, he held my wrist. Not tightly, just the touch of someone who wants to make sure you stay a little longer. "Son, there's something I needed to tell you a long time ago. I just never found the right moment." I sat back down. He looked toward the window for a moment, as if choosing the words, or as if checking that nobody else would hear. And then he told me that before I was born, he had gone through a very difficult period, serious problems, the kind that put an entire life at risk, and that one night, driving on a road he did not know, he had arrived at a crossroads and had met a man. I felt my blood run cold. I said nothing. I just kept listening. My father said the man had made him a proposal similar to what I already knew, that he, young, desperate, unable to see a way out, had accepted. He had asked for stability, health, for things to work out. And things did work out. Everything I asked for came, he said. Not magically, not overnight, but it came. The doors that had been closed started opening, and for a long time I told myself it was coincidence, that I had changed my attitude, that I had worked harder, that luck had changed. He stopped, looked at his hands. But there is one thing that never went away, a feeling. You know when you feel like you've forgotten to do something important, but you cannot remember what? That is how I have felt since that night. Every time I sleep, there is a moment before I drift off when I feel like someone is waiting. Not angrily, just waiting. We sat in silence for a while. Then he said quietly, "I'm afraid that waiting is coming to an end." I wanted to say no. I wanted to say he was going to be fine, that it was imagination, that decades of guilt and worry had built that feeling inside his head. I wanted to say many things, but I could not say anything, because I had been at that crossroads days before. And I knew, in a way impossible to prove, but impossible to deny, that what he had felt for decades was real.